Was Moses himself an allegory? Is the entire story found in Genesis an allegory? Is Jesus Christ's life an allegory? You do realize that there are scholars right now today who actually do say that. They say Jesus never even lived. This is all just an allegory for our soul's journey. So how far are you willing to take the allegory? Originally, it never was allegorically understood in any manner. They simply took the scripture for what it said. Now, according to J.N.D. Kelly, he says Judaism was the cradle in which Christianity was nourished. This was the source to which it was uniquely indebted to. Christianity arose out of Judaism. The early Christian categories of understanding God as an embodied being is based upon a literal reading of the Hebrew Scriptures that were unabashedly anthropomorphic. James Drummond admits that even the Jews advanced theologically to a higher conception of God. We can hardly doubt that the mass of the people would be satisfied with the Scripture's literal meaning, and that their idea of God was the purest anthropomorphism. Similarly, George Footmore claims that Palestinian Judaism was innocent of any abstract or transcendent or any other sort of a philosophical idea of God. The Jews just didn't have it in the Old Testament, nor in early Christianity, until Philo came along and made it that way, because he was a philosopher, not a prophet. And he asserts the philosophical horror of anthropomorphisms which Philo entertained, it was unknown in the Palestinian schools. They endeavored to think of God worthily and to speak of him reverently. But their criteria for this reverence was the Scripture and the instinct of piety, not an alien metaphysics. The theme that God is incorporeal, immaterial, is an alien metaphysics that is read back into the Scriptures. It's not there originally. And it's not. All you have to do is read the Old Testament and the New Testament. Thoroughly influencing the basic concepts of formative Judaism was indeed the understanding of God's incarnation. So here's how early Judaism understood this. Jacob Neusner says that a common place for Judaism's from the foundation of Scripture forward, by incarnation, Neusner says it is the representation of God in the flesh as corporeal and consubstantial in emotion and virtue with human beings, and shared in the modes and means of action carried out by mortals. In other words, God does deeds exactly as men and women do. There is a powerful and natural rich legacy of anthropomorphism that Rabbi Hoshea could tell a story about the time when God came to create man and how the ministering angels mistook Adam for God. Why did the Holy One, blessed be He, do? What did He do? He caused sleep to fall upon him so that all that knew that he was a mortal man. Even the angels mistook the creation of man's body as God. That's fascinating. That tells you what the image of God was. Then God made Adam go to sleep, and that proved he was mortal. But he had the same type of body God did. Now, the idea is not to confuse man with God here, but to teach an understanding that draws humanity upward and does not bring God downward. Some Christians today say, well, what you do is you de-glorify God by giving him a body. No. What we do is we elevate humankind toward God because we are after the image and likeness of God. Now, nowhere is this Jewish anthropomorphism more evident than in the teachings of several classical rabbis. Alan Gottstein describes this situation that is remarkable. He says, in all of rabbinic literature, covering both the Tanaitic, the 70 to 200 AD time period, and the Amoraic, the 220 to 500 AD time period, in all of the rabbinic literatures from 70 up to 500 AD, we're talking several centuries here, he says there is not a single statement that categorically denies that God has a body or a form. In my understanding, the question of whether the rabbis believed in a God who has form is one that needs little discussion. There's no point in discussing it. Of course they taught he had a form. The question indeed is not, does God have a body? That's the wrong question for the rabbis. The question is, what kind of body does God have? Quite the insight, isn't it? Now, Gottstein further contends something else that's really interesting. The bodily meaning is the only meaning of Zelem, image, in all of rabbinic literature. This suggestion is borne out in all Tanaitic and Amoraic sources. The rabbinical interpretation of the image of God as referring to the body is clearly shown in the following representative selection, a story about Rabbi Hillel. His disciples asked him, "Master, whither are you bound?" He answered them, "To perform a religious duty." "What," they asked, "is this religious duty?" He said to them, "To wash in the bathhouse." And they said, "Is this a religious duty?" "Yes," he replied. "If the statues of kings which are erected in theaters and circuses are scoured and washed by the man who is appointed to look after them, and who thereby obtains his maintenance through them, nay, more, he is exalted in the company of the great of the kingdom, how much more I, who have been created in the image and the likeness?" Now, rabbinic anthropomorphism so strikingly contrasts with later, that is 3rd century and on, Christian immaterialism. But it closely parallels Joseph Smith's understanding of God, that it will be helpful to summarize Gottstein's account of the rabbinic concepts in some detail. And this is utterly incredible, how Gottstein summarizes the rabbinic interpretation of God. Now, Gottstein shows that the rabbinic anthropomorphism was not a crude notion in which God's body, or even Adam's body for that notion, which is created in the image of God's body, he shows these were not seen as identical or even similar to our present fallen mortal human bodies. Adam, when he was first created, was a bright, luminous being. And his original body was more radiant than the sun. But God's body, in whose image Adam was made, is still more brilliant and beautiful. Although God's body resembles the human body in form, it differs from the human body in function. This is according to the rabbis. But it's definitely a physical, exact replica of God's body. When Adam fell, he lost his luminosity. Next, Gottstein proposes a model for reconciling apparently contradictory rabbinic passages pertaining to the issue of whether man, as the result of sin, lost the image of God. As we've seen, Adam's Zelem is his luminous body. In other sources, such as the story of Hillel washing his body, the Zelem referred to the physical body. Zelem can thus refer to various levels or aspects, all of which bear a resemblance to the physical body, the Hebrew word Zelem. I would propose that these various levels or the various bodies reflect one another. The physical body is a reflection of the body of light, a kind of graded devolutionary process. This may be a model for two ways of talking about the Hebrew word Zelem. The Zelem in its original form may be lost, but the dimmer reflection of this form is extant in our physical bodies right now, which may still be spoken of as a Zelem. Finally, Gottstein ventures a partial explanation of why the rabbinic interpretation of image is exclusively bodily, compared to the subsequent non-bodily interpretation given by the Christian immaterialists.